WWE has always been known for its larger-than-life superstars, but not everyone is cut out for this brutal world. Some wrestlers are so wild, eccentric, or downright uncontrollable that fans can't help but be both shocked and thrilled. They push every boundary, defy every rule, and sometimes turn matches into unforgettable spectacles. In today's video, we're counting down 13 wrestlers who were far too dangerous to survive in WWE, but left a mark that can never be erased. 13. Nick Gage. If there's one wrestler WWE would never dare to touch, it's Nick Gage. Known as the King of Deathmatch in GCW, Gage carved out his legacy through bouts so violent that no major company could ever contain them. While WWE projects a family-friendly, PG image, Gage embodies pure extremity, blood, danger, and chaos. The two worlds simply cannot coexist. Unlike wrestlers who occasionally use props for drama, Gage turns an entire arsenal of weapons into his signature style. Shattered glass, box cutters, fluorescent light tubes, barbed wire, even shards of broken glass scattered across the ring. His matches almost always end in a blood-soaked spectacle, leaving both the canvas and his own body shredded. It's the kind of brutality that shocks the crowd yet keeps them glued to the action, because everything he does is real, nothing watered down to please TV executives. What makes Gage a phenomenon isn't just the violence, but also his turbulent life story. He served time in prison for mistakes outside the ring, only to return to wrestling to a hero's welcome. Fans embraced him as a symbol of live and die for wrestling, a cult-like figure whose bond with the audience runs deeper than wins and losses. Every match feels like a blood sacrifice dedicated to those who stand by him. But that same extremity is exactly why WWE will never feature him. A company so protective of its public image could never put someone like Gage on their programming. One glimpse of his style would be enough to alarm sponsors and media outlets. For him, GCW and the world of deathmatch are the true home, places where chaos and carnage aren't just accepted, they're celebrated. 12. Sabu. When it comes to names forever tied to hardcore wrestling, leaving out Sabu would be a mistake. He carried a chilling nickname that summed him up perfectly: homicidal, genocidal, suicidal. That title wasn't just for show, it reflected a career built on sacrificing his own body, willing to bleed and break himself just to take down his opponents. For Sabu, violence wasn't simply a tool, it was a way of life. Even the notoriously tough Atsushi Onita once told him, "You need to hold back." Sabu's body itself became living proof of his reckless devotion. Bruises, broken bones, and scars carved across his frame stood like permanent tattoos of chaos. They were earned from thousands of crashes through tables, dives into steel chairs, shards of glass, and barbed wire tangling into his skin. Never known for polished technique, Sabu leaned into his unhinged style to mask those limitations. Every match felt less like wrestling and more like a dangerous spectacle, keeping fans both horrified and glued to the action. If you've ever watched Botchamania, you'd recognize how he turned mistakes into a trademark. Strangely enough, that reckless energy became the very thing that made him so captivating. Yet, what turned him into a legend in ECW was also what doomed him in WWE. When Vince McMahon tried to revive ECW as a toned-down, family-friendly product, there was no real place for Sabu. Years of self-destruction had left his body worn down, and his brutal, chaotic style couldn't be repackaged into the clean, theatrical wrestling WWE demanded. Almost overnight, the Wild Man fans once revered became just another name struggling under WWE's spotlight. The irony of Sabu's career is that the same extreme nature that made him an icon also kept him from thriving in wrestling's biggest stage. Still, for those who crave blood, chaos, and pure hardcore spirit, Sabu will always stand as a symbol of that era, even if WWE could never contain him. 11. Abyss. Abyss has always been regarded as a modern monster in professional wrestling, reminiscent of Abdullah the Butcher, yet with a distinct identity of his own. Inside the ring, he turned anything within reach into a weapon of destruction. Barbed wire, wrapped baseball bats, gasoline-soaked tables, wooden boards studded with nails ready to pierce flesh, all became instruments of terror in his hands. With his massive frame, signature mask, and relentless style, Abyss struck fear into anyone who dared face him. Unlike Abdullah the Butcher, however, Abyss balanced brutality with a sense of entertainment that connected with mainstream audiences. He didn't rely on knives, forks, or grotesque antics to generate fear. What made him stand out was his ability to blend the raw power of a monster with solid wrestling skill. His years in TNA proved that balance perfectly. In an environment where hardcore wrestling was not only accepted but celebrated, Abyss became a true icon. His unforgettable battles, whether in Monsters Ball matches or other extreme showcases, cemented his legacy. Still, with a career built on blood-soaked warfare, stepping into WWE was virtually impossible. During the PG era, when Vince McMahon positioned WWE as a polished, family-friendly product, the sight of a barbed wire, covered giant hurling opponents into beds of nails was something that could never be televised. That fundamental clash kept the WWE doors shut for Abyss, despite his undeniable talent and presence. Yet Abyss found another way to leave a lasting imprint. Joseph Park, the man behind the mask, ultimately carved out a role in Florida, passing down his experience and fiery passion to the next generation. WWE may never have showcased Abyss inside its ring, but his name endures as proof that some wrestlers are simply too extreme, too unhinged to exist in a sanitized world like WWE. 10. Bruiser Brody. Bruiser Brody embodied pure chaos in professional wrestling, a notorious brawler defined by raw violence and an untamed spirit. Many still call him the father of hardcore wrestling, as his brutal approach paved the way for future generations who embraced blood and mayhem. With his wild hair, towering frame, and fierce glare, Brody projected an image so terrifying that some parents even used his likeness to scare their children. At the height of his career, Brody was never confined to one territory. He made appearances in the WWF, but his run left little impact. The reason was clear. At a time when Vince McMahon Jr. was transforming New York into a family-oriented spectacle, Brody's bloody, no-holds-barred style simply didn't fit. WWE wanted glitz and entertainment for the masses, not a rampaging giant who looked like he could tear down everything in his path. That rejection, however, never diminished him. On the contrary, Brody became a major star across multiple territories: WCCW, Central States Wrestling, AWA, and beyond. Wherever he went, the atmosphere was electric. His presence carried an energy that couldn't be contained, and his matches left crowds both fearful and enthralled. He didn't need New York to remain a top attraction. His legend grew through sheer force of personality and the unwavering loyalty of fans who followed him across regions. Despite his immense influence, Bruiser Brody never conquered the New York stronghold and never reached the global stardom of WWF's top names of that era. But perhaps he didn't care. For Brody, freedom and authenticity mattered more than mainstream recognition. That refusal to compromise is exactly what cemented him as a symbol of hardcore spirit, a wild force of nature, far too unhinged to ever be confined within WWE's polished framework. 9. Necro Butcher, a living nightmare. If one had to choose a face that embodies chaos and blood-soaked brutality in independent wrestling, Necro Butcher would be at the top of the list. With his rugged appearance, tangled hair, and fierce glare, he earned notoriety not only for his reckless style, but also for his willingness to turn his own body into a weapon to shock audiences. For Necro, the ring wasn't just a place to compete, it was a battlefield where he sacrificed flesh and blood in exchange for the crowd's frenzy. Throughout his career, Necro Butcher was synonymous with extreme deathmatches. He hurled himself headfirst through panes of glass, endured barbed wire tearing into his skin, and often left the ring drenched in blood just to deliver a shocking climax. Many fans couldn't even bear to watch the sheer savagery, yet that level of violence became his trademark. He didn't shy away from self-inflicted punishment. In fact, he treated it as an art form. What made Necro Butcher stand out was a mix of bravery and madness. In countless matches, rather than dodging, he willingly absorbed crushing chair shots or fluorescent tube strikes, only to rise again, face covered in blood, raising his fists to taunt his opponent. That image turned him into a symbol of cruelty and fearless endurance for the die-hard followers of deathmatch wrestling. But imagine Necro stepping into WWE, a company where everything is tightly controlled, blood is heavily restricted, and family audiences dominate. A man willing to carve up his own body to satisfy fans would inevitably be seen as far too extreme. WWE knew who he was, but they also knew his presence would shatter the PG boundaries they worked so hard to preserve. That's why Necro Butcher has always belonged to the underground world of violent wrestling, where pain isn't avoided, it's celebrated. 8. The Sandman. When talking about ECW's golden era, the Sandman is a name that can't be overlooked. James Fullington, the man behind the persona, was never known for elite technical skills, but he carried an attitude and charisma that could electrify an arena. The image of him emerging from the crowd, beer in one hand, cigarette dangling from his lips, and swinging a Singapore cane with reckless defiance became an unmistakable trademark. He felt like a raw, rebellious counterpart to Stone Cold Steve Austin. Only with Sandman, most of his strikes came from instinct rather than polished technique. Paul Heyman, the mastermind of ECW, had a gift for turning flaws into strengths. With Sandman, he created a phenomenon. From someone few expected to make it far, Sandman rose to cult status, celebrated as a chaotic symbol of extreme wrestling. He embodied the idea that sometimes sheer presence and recklessness can outshine technical limitations. However, when WWE revived the ECW brand in 2006, Sandman was brought back as well. Unfortunately, the bright lights of WWE didn't suit his unrestrained character. Stripped of his Metallica entrance music, forced to drop the ever-present cigarette, and toned down from the violent edge that made him famous, Sandman became a diluted version of himself. Fans who hoped for the wild storm of rebellion they remembered were instead given what many jokingly called the bland man. Without the freedom to be who he truly was, Sandman quickly felt out of place in WWE. His style relied heavily on crowd energy and raw spectacle rather than pure wrestling ability, leaving little room to thrive in such a controlled environment. As a result, his WWE run ended up being more of a fleeting footnote than the legendary chapter he once wrote in ECW. 7. Kevin Sullivan. If there was ever a figure who blurred the line between fiction and reality, it was Kevin Sullivan. He crafted a chilling persona, shifting between eerie mysticism and disturbing obsessions, completely different from the usual characters fans were used to seeing on television. Branded as the Taskmaster, Sullivan carried a dark, almost sinister aura that convinced many people he might truly be consumed by demonic forces. This wasn't tongue-in-cheek, adult entertainment, but a legitimately grim character, shocking for audiences of that era. While many of his peers focused on rebellious or eccentric traits, Sullivan pushed things much further. He blended ritualistic themes, occult-like costumes, and mysterious storytelling into his performances, making it feel as though he had stepped out of a horror movie rather than a wrestling ring. That level of extremity guaranteed he would never find a place in WWE, a company that prided itself on being family-friendly. A promotion catering to such a broad audience simply couldn't accommodate a persona that dark and controversial. Ironically, Sullivan was ahead of his time. The supernatural elements he experimented with were later perfected by The Undertaker in the early 90s, and those same ideas went on to achieve mainstream success. But before WWE was ready to embrace anything so otherworldly, Sullivan was written off as too extreme for their television product. On top of that, Sullivan also took on backstage leadership roles in WCW, which only further distanced him from ever appearing in WWE. He became proof that no matter how inventive a character might be, some creations just can't survive within the boundaries of a company built on safety and mass appeal. With such a polarizing career, Kevin Sullivan stands as one of those figures simply too unhinged ever to belong in WWE. 6. James Mitchell. Whether fans knew him as the Sinister Minister, Father James Mitchell, or even Daryl Van Horn, his image was always tied to an eerie, magnetic presence that few could look away from. With his sharp features, blazing red hair, and a voice that echoed like a curse straight from hell, Mitchell never walked to the ring like an ordinary manager. Instead, he carried himself as a figure of dread, someone who brought nightmares to life. What made it more fascinating was that Mitchell considered being called frightening the highest compliment to his craft. It wasn't just his appearance that set him apart. Mitchell's gift with a microphone made him unforgettable. His promos were razor-sharp and theatrical, sometimes laced with subtle insinuations, other times brutally direct. During his Smoky Mountain wrestling days, he shocked crowds by slipping risque undertones into his speeches, so cleverly done that even his bosses didn't catch on. Later, as Father James Mitchell, his words took on a darker, religious tone, weaving in themes of faith, damnation, and divine judgment. For him, the mic wasn't just a tool, it was a scepter, powerful enough to hypnotize an entire arena. Ironically, while many promotions struggled to accept his extreme persona, WCW became the place where Mitchell thrived. There, he carved out a role as a manipulative manager who spread fear through a blend of sharp rhetoric and ominous theatrics. But when WWE brought him in during the ECW revival, The experiment quickly proved he was far too unsettling for a company that prided itself on being family-friendly. Mitchell's fiery sermons, designed to push emotions to the edge, were dismissed as too excessive in WWE's environment. Because of that, he never became a fixture there. His career stands as a reminder that sometimes, talent and creativity can exceed the boundaries of what mainstream wrestling is willing to contain. 5. Atsushi Onita, the father of violence. When talking about wrestlers who turned the ring into a battlefield drenched in blood, Atsushi Onita's name is impossible to ignore. More than just a competitor, he is regarded as the father of deathmatch wrestling in Japan, a form of performance where pain, blood, and danger weren't accidents but the main attraction. And for that very reason, he was someone you could never imagine inside WWE, a company built on bright lights and family-friendly entertainment that would never allow itself to be overshadowed by smoke, explosions, and chaos. Onita began with a traditional style, but after a career-threatening injury, he returned in an entirely unexpected way, by creating FMW, a groundbreaking promotion that elevated exploding barbed wire matches and blood-soaked spectacles to a new level. Just the sight of a ring wrapped in razor-sharp wire, with explosives set to detonate around it, was enough to make fans tremble in fear while cheering in excitement. And Onita, who never hesitated to throw himself into the fire, became the living embodiment of extreme wrestling. What made Onita stand out was the balance between reckless daredevil and heroic figure. He often cast himself as the courageous warrior, battling vicious factions, sacrificing his body and enduring brutal wounds simply to give the audience an unforgettable story. That willingness to suffer for the fans turned him into a cultural icon in Japan, not only worshipped in the ring but also respected enough to serve as a member of parliament. Now, try to picture that in WWE, a company where matches are tightly regulated, blood is practically banned, and everything must fit within PG standards. The sight of Onita, exploding in the middle of the ring, bandaged and bleeding, is something Vince McMahon, or any WWE producer, would never let air on television. And so, his legacy remains tied to the smoky, dangerous arenas of FMW, where madness wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. 4. The original Sheik. When it comes to pioneers of the hardcore style, the name The Original Sheik, Ed Farhat, will always stand among the first. He wasn't just a wrestler. He was the man who defined an entire blood-soaked approach to the business, where the line between performance and sheer brutality nearly vanished. Interestingly, in 2007 WWE inducted him into the Hall of Fame, placing him alongside names like Coco B. Ware, the Bushwhackers, and even Drew Carey. Yet the irony is clear. The very style that made Sheik a legend was also the reason he could never truly belong in WWE. In the late 1960s, Sheik made only scattered appearances for Vince McMahon Sr. from the very start. He stood out as an outcast in a system that valued mainstream-friendly entertainment. With his use of sharp objects, bloody attacks, and levels of violence far beyond accepted norms, there was no way for him to maintain a steady spot in a television-driven, family-oriented product. Forced to move on, Sheik didn't fade away. He expanded his influence elsewhere. Back home in Detroit, he transformed local rings into stages where fans came to witness pure chaos. His reign of violence also reached Los Angeles, where his battles with Freddie Blassie became the stuff of legend. These encounters, drenched in blood and rage, carved unforgettable moments into wrestling history. What made Sheik different was that, unlike others who adapted their personas to fit the market, he never diluted his character. He remained true to his merciless image until the very end, even if it meant he would never find a permanent place in New York's spotlight. That unwavering commitment paved the way for the next generation, those who would elevate hardcore wrestling into something celebrated rather than shunned. The Sheik may never have been a natural fit for WWE, but his legacy is undeniable. He belongs not to one company, but to the very foundation of wrestling's most extreme traditions. 3. Mick Foley. Today, when fans think of Mick Foley, they often picture a warm, humorous figure who can make audiences laugh with his awkward charm. He became beloved for his sincerity, storytelling skill, and ability to connect with fans of all ages. But before he was portrayed as that lovable fool, Foley embodied brutality, rebellion, and a reckless daring that left anyone watching in awe and fear. As Cactus Jack, Foley, alongside the legendary Terry Funk, turned hardcore matches into true nightmares. Their battles went far beyond tables and barbed wire. They incorporated explosives and dangerous props, creating collisions so violent that even a single viewing could leave a lifelong impression. At the time, VHS tapes capturing the blood-soaked, fiery chaos became coveted collector's items, cementing Cactus Jack's status as an underground legend. The price Foley paid was immense. His body endured countless injuries, scars covering his flesh, broken teeth and bones, and even damaged ears. This extreme dedication earned him fans' respect, yet it also made him a too dangerous figure for companies focused on safety. When he joined WWE, Foley was reborn as Mankind, a psychologically complex, eccentric, yet deeply layered character. Rather than relying solely on violence, Foley explored the mind, portraying an unstable figure who was both terrifying and unpredictable. This transformation proved he was more than a reckless daredevil. He was an artist capable of adding profound depth to his performance. Still, in his locker, Foley always kept a bag of sharp nails, a quiet reminder that the monster known as Cactus Jack never truly disappeared. He was simply lying in wait. 2. New Jack. It's hardly surprising that New Jack makes this list. In fact, just mentioning his name is enough to send chills down anyone's spine. Throughout the 1990s, New Jack wasn't merely a hardcore wrestler. He was a living embodiment of chaos and unbridled violence. Wherever he appeared, one thing was guaranteed: blood would be spilled. Unlike many wrestlers who use props for dramatic effect, New Jack often carried knives, hammers, baseball bats wrapped in barbed wire, and even stun guns. What made him truly terrifying was that he never hesitated to use them for real. One of the most infamous incidents was the mass transit event. During that match, New Jack slashed a young wrestler named Eric Cooley, who had lied about his age to compete, leaving him with severe blood loss and sending him to the hospital. For most, this would have been shocking, but New Jack showed no remorse. Instead, he grabbed the microphone and delivered scathing taunts directly to the crowd, turning outrage into a core part of his villainous persona. But his notoriety didn't end with controversial incidents. He openly admitted that in a rematch with Vic Grimes, he deliberately tried to seriously harm his opponent as revenge for a previous brutal injury. The fall from the top rope at Living Dangerously 2000 remains one of the most haunting moments in wrestling history. His reckless behavior, combined with a blatant disregard for consequences, blurred the line between performance and reality every time he stepped into the ring. With a record like that, it's easy to see why Vince McMahon and WWE never touched New Jack. Too extreme, too dangerous, and most importantly, uncontrollable. In a company always focused on family-safe entertainment, New Jack was simply a nightmare they would never allow inside. 1. Abdullah the Butcher. When it comes to names that strike fear in the ring, Abdullah the Butcher must be mentioned first. He didn't rely on complicated maneuvers or traditional wrestling techniques. For Abdullah, a fork, yes, the kind used for eating, became a weapon far deadlier than any hold. Just by looking at his forehead, marked with deep, jagged cuts, it's easy to see why fans were both fascinated and terrified every time he appeared. Throughout his career, Abdullah turned everyday objects into instruments of violence. That fork in his hand was no longer for food. It was driven straight into an opponent's forehead, sending blood flying everywhere. With his massive frame and ruthless presence, he didn't need technical finesse. What he possessed was raw brutality, transforming each match into a living horror show. The frightening part? Fans were drawn to this extremity. Across the globe, from North America and Japan to the Middle East, Abdullah became a sought-after star, simply because people wanted to witness just how far his madness could go. Over a 52-year career, he made his bloody style a trademark, earning both fame and fortune without relying on technical weaponry. Yet there was one place Abdullah never set foot: WWE. In Vince McMahon's eyes, a product aimed at mass audiences couldn't accommodate a character who turned knives and forks into a signature. While Abdullah thrived elsewhere, the big show in New York never had room for him. There, the standard demanded refinement, control, and certainly no whirlwind of violence like Abdullah's. With the legacy he left behind, Abdullah the Butcher stands as the ultimate example of someone too unhinged to exist in WWE. He didn't just blur the line between sport and savagery. He proved that even something as simple as a fork could become an iconic symbol etched into wrestling history. Those were 13 of the craziest wrestlers WWE ever faced. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe to Wrestling Sphere so you won't miss any of our other thrilling stories.